Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. I am so excited for today because, wow, we've got a lot to talk about. We've got articles from all across the U.S. We've got the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, of course.
Yeah.
We've got the Baltimore Sun, Boston Globe, Chicago Tribune, Honolulu Star-Advertiser, Houston Chronicle, Las Vegas Review-Journal.
It's like a cross-country road trip.
It really does.
Yeah.
We've also got the LA Times, Miami Herald, Minnesota Star-Tribune, New Orleans Advocate, New York Times, Omaha World Herald, Philadelphia Inquirer, Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, and to round things out, USA Today. This is exciting. You're really going to be getting a good feel for what's going on all over the place. I know that you've already gotten a look at all these.
Briefly.
Yes. But have you had a chance to really, connect the dots?
Yeah.
Because that's what I'm super excited to do today.
I am ready when you are.
Let's do it. Well, one thing that jumps out right away just from glancing at the headlines is all the buzz about President-elect Trump, and, I mean, understandably so, right? Big election, big changes coming down the pipeline. I'm seeing articles about how Georgia Democrats are kind of shifting their strategies, and then in Maryland, there's a lot of concern about cuts to the federal workforce. What's your initial take on all this? Is this kind of like normal post-election jitters, or is there something more going on here?
I think it's deeper than jitters this time. You know these policies, they're going to have a real impact, and it's easy to see why people would be a little on edge. That Baltimore Sun article about the federal workforce, for example, that really hit home for me. Maryland, they've got so many federal jobs, tons of them concentrated right there.
Right, it's not just like a small percentage of their workforce or anything.
Absolutely not. I mean, you've got the headquarters for Social Security, you've got the National Institutes of Health, all these big players. If those cuts happen, we're talking about thousands of people's lives being affected. It's not just numbers on a spreadsheet.
It's real people with families. It's their livelihoods. And then you've got the social anxieties, too. I was reading that Boston Globe piece about all the transgender folks who are rushing to update their legal documents like birth certificates and passports. I mean, that's got to be stressful.
Oh, yeah. That's a really powerful example of how politics can really hit people where it hurts. During the campaign, there was all that talk about potentially revoking funding for gender-affirming care. And they were even saying they might target doctors who provide those services.
I'd forgotten about that. Wow. So, yeah, you can see why people would feel that urgency.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so we've got the political anxiety, but let's shift gears a bit and talk about the economic side of things. I know both the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and the Omaha World Herald have articles about farmers who were super worried about Trump's proposed tariffs. And their concern is that, these tariffs will kick off these big trade wars and really hurt the agricultural industry. And you know how vital exports are, right? So what do you think the potential fallout from that could be?
I think that's where things get really tricky because you're talking about the connection between U.S. policy and the global economy, right? And the Omaha World Herald, they really drive that point home. They focus on Nebraska, which is actually the fifth largest agricultural exporting state in the country.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize they were that high up there.
Yeah, and if those tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China go through, it could really hurt their farmers. We're talking income, we're talking livelihoods, potentially even entire farms going under.
It's kind of like a domino effect.
Exactly. One policy decision, and then boom, it just ripples out across borders and industries. It can be hard to predict the full impact.
Yeah, that's really unsettling to think about. So is there any good news out there? Are there any glimmers of hope in all this economic doom and gloom?
Well, there's always something, right? If you look closely enough. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution, they had a piece about these auto-IRA programs that are popping up.
Auto-IRA, what's that?
So some states are setting these programs up to help people who don't have retirement savings plans through their employers.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right. It could be huge, especially for people who traditionally haven't been able to save much for retirement. Imagine a future where everyone, no matter what their job is, they've got some kind of safety net for when they retire.
That would be amazing. But doesn't that raise questions about government overreach? Shouldn't that be left to the individual or their employer?
It does, and the article acknowledges that concern. But here's the interesting thing. The research suggests that these programs, they're actually not discouraging employers from offering their own plans. So it could be a win-win, workers get access to retirement savings and employers don't get stuck with more regulations or costs.
Wow, that's a really promising model, and who knows, maybe it could be applied to other areas where the government could step in and actually help facilitate things.
That's the hope.
All right, let's shift gears one more time. I want to dive into some of President-elect Trump's specific cabinet picks because there's been a lot of talk about potential conflicts of interest, qualifications, and what these choices signal for his administration.
Right. Lots to unpack there. The Houston Chronicle, for example, they were pretty concerned about Trump's decision to pick Linda McMahon, the former WWE CEO, as Secretary of Education. A lot of people are raising red flags, pointing to her lack of experience in public education and her conservative ties.
Yeah. And didn't she also resign from the Connecticut Board of Education at some point? Something to do with fundraising regulations?
You're right, she did. Which does make you wonder about her priorities and potential conflicts of interest going into this new role.
Exactly. It's a big question mark. And then there's that other controversial choice, Kash Patel as FBI director. I think every single one of these newspapers had something to say about that.
Oh, yeah, that one's causing quite a stir. A lot of people are interpreting it as Trump shaking things up at the FBI, maybe to go after those he sees as his enemies.
Oh, wow. Yeah, you're right. That definitely adds a whole other layer to this story.
Right.
What's your take on this appointment?
Well, what I find concerning is that Patel, he doesn't have that high-level legal and management experience that we've seen in past FBI directors. So I think it's fair to question his qualifications and what his agenda for the agency might be. It does raise a lot of questions about his intentions.
You're right. That's a bold move on Trump's part. It could be risky, and it will definitely be scrutinized. Speaking of controversial moves, we can't ignore all this talk about Biden pardoning his son, Hunter. It's everywhere. Gun charges, tax charges. It's front-page news.
Oh, absolutely. That story's been dominating the headlines. And there are accusations flying everywhere about political favoritism, abuse of power. I mean, Biden promised he wouldn't interfere, remember?
And then to make matters worse, he's claiming the prosecution was politically motivated, trying to get to him, which just pours gasoline on the fire, don't you think?
Oh, for sure. It's a highly charged situation. And there are so many questions about how presidential power is used, the potential for conflicts of interest. It's a messy story with legal and political ramifications we're going to have to keep a close eye on.
Definitely a lot to unpack there. It feels like we've got Trump's cabinet picks causing a stir, Biden's actions raising all sorts of ethical questions, and all these swirling political and economic currents shaping the landscape. Where should we even go from here? What else is jumping out at you from this massive stack of news?
Well, one thing that caught my eye is the focus on clean energy, and more specifically, the challenge of integrating battery storage into the power grid. The Chicago Tribune had a really interesting piece on that.
Oh, yeah, I saw that one too. It's so fascinating, right? Because on the one hand, you have all this amazing potential with renewable energy sources like solar and wind. But the problem is they're not always available, right? You need the sun to be shining and the wind to be blowing. That's where battery storage comes in.
Exactly. Battery storage is like the key to making renewable energy truly reliable and consistent, not just a backup option. The article actually highlights the work of this incredible scientist, Dr. Shirley Meng. She and her team of material engineers at the University of Chicago, they're developing these really affordable and efficient sodium-ion batteries that could store all that renewable energy for later use.
It's mind-blowing, isn't it? Like research happening in a lab in Chicago could potentially change the way we power the world.
It really could. What's even more exciting is that it's not just scientists pushing for this change. The article mentions that Illinois lawmakers, they're actually considering legislation that would incentivize battery storage development. So we're seeing collaboration between scientists, policymakers, and even industry leaders.
That is encouraging. When we see that kind of collective effort, it really does make you think that we can overcome these challenges.
Okay, I want to jump back to something we touched on earlier, the way traditional industries are adapting to this digital age. That Wall Street Journal article about Bible sales surging, that one really caught me off guard. In a world that seems increasingly secular, you wouldn't expect that.
Right. It definitely challenges those assumptions. And what's interesting is that it wasn't just about people turning back to religion because of anxiety or anything like that. Publishers are getting savvy. They're using online sales and social media marketing to reach completely new audiences.
So the Bible's going viral. That's wild. It makes you wonder what other industries could reinvent themselves like that. Speaking of the Wall Street Journal, was there anything else in there that caught your eye?
Well, there was this surprisingly fascinating article about high finance entering the world of bull riding, of all things. Billionaires are pouring money into the sport, completely changing its financial landscape. Wall Street and bull riding. That's an interesting combination, to say the least. What do you think is driving these investors? Is it purely a money-making scheme, or is there something else going on?
It's probably a mix of things. The potential for big returns, the excitement of a growing and popular sport, maybe even a genuine passion for bull riding itself. Who knows? Maybe some of these billionaires grew up on ranches and this is their way of reconnecting with their roots.
I love that. All right, let's talk about an issue that's been in the news a lot lately. Public safety and how we deal with threats of violence, especially when it comes to schools. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution had a piece about potentially increasing penalties for making threats against schools in Georgia.
That's a really tough one, right? How do you balance the need for safety with the potential for overreacting and punishing kids who might not actually pose a real threat? There are no easy answers.
It's a very delicate balance. Obviously, the safety of students and staff is paramount, but we don't want to end up criminalizing childish mistakes or overreactions. And that article mentioned that after that school shooting at Appalachia High School, there was a huge surge in threats. People were understandably on edge and calling for a crackdown.
Right, and it's easy to understand why. But the article also included perspectives from some school safety experts who are cautioning against this zero-tolerance approach.
It makes sense. It's so important to remember that every situation is different, and we need to look at them on a case-by-case basis. Okay, switching gears again, the Baltimore Sun had a really sobering piece about all the traffic fatalities on Bel Air Road. They're calling for some major action to make that road safer.
Yeah, that was a tough one to read. Apparently, Bel Air Road accounts for more than 10% of all auto fatalities in the city this year. That's a seriously alarming statistic. It just shows how urgent the need for safety improvements is.
It's a wake-up call, isn't it? And it makes you think about all the underlying factors that contribute to these tragedies. The road design, traffic flow, enforcement. It's also a reminder of how important local journalism is. They shine a light on these issues and hold people accountable for finding solutions.
And speaking of accountability, we can't just gloss over that whole controversy surrounding Biden's pardon of his son, Hunter. It's a story that raises some serious questions about transparency and ethical conduct at the highest levels of government.
It's definitely a story that's hard to ignore. What would you say is the most troubling aspect of this whole situation?
For me, it's the broken promise. Biden explicitly said he wouldn't interfere, and then he did. And his reasoning, claiming it was all politically motivated, just makes it worse. It really undermines trust in his judgment and his motivations.
It feels like this could have far-reaching consequences for Biden's legacy and for the public's faith in the government as a whole. So here we are with political scandals, safety concerns, economic challenges, and a global landscape that feels incredibly unstable. It can all feel so overwhelming. Where do we even begin to make sense of it all?
It's true, the world is incredibly complex, and it's easy to get lost in the constant stream of information. But that's why we do this, right? To untangle those threads and try to make sense of it all. To find those patterns, those connections, those stories that help us understand what's really going on.
Absolutely. And I think that's what stood out to me most about this collection of articles. They all highlight how those individual stories can really help us understand these larger trends and issues. It's those personal narratives that make it all so much more real and tangible.
You're so right. It's easy to get lost in the abstract when we're talking about politics, economics, or global affairs. But when you hear about how these issues affect real people, it suddenly becomes much more immediate.
Like, take that article from the Chicago Tribune about those families dealing with the aftermath of the Stateville Correctional Center being demolished. The inmates are being transferred to other prisons, and it's causing all sorts of disruptions and heartache. That story about Lillian Bell, who can't visit her son as often now because he's been moved farther away, it just broke my heart.
It's a powerful reminder that every policy decision, even those that seem purely logistical, has real human consequences. And then there was that other story from the Baltimore Sun about Jenny McFadden and her belief that her health problems are connected to all that coal dust in Curtis Bay.
Oh yeah, that one was really eye-opening.
It raises the whole issue of environmental justice, how progress often comes at a cost, and it's usually marginalized communities who end up bearing the brunt of it.
It's a reminder that we can't just celebrate progress without considering who's paying the price. We need to make sure that development benefits everyone, that everyone has access to clean air, clean water, and a healthy environment. Speaking of the environment, did you see that Omaha World Herald piece about that landmark climate change case at the UN's highest court?
I did. That one felt really hopeful, like a potential turning point in the fight for climate action.
I thought so too. And the fact that it's Vanuatu, this tiny island nation in the Pacific, leading the charge, they're literally facing an existential threat from rising sea levels.
And they're not backing down. It's a real David and Goliath story, isn't it? And it highlights how international law could actually hold powerful countries accountable for their actions.
It does give you some hope that we can find a way to address this crisis collectively. Okay, we can't talk about global challenges without mentioning those ongoing conflicts that are causing so much suffering. I was reading the New York Times update on the situation in Syria, and honestly, it seems like things are getting even more complicated.
Oh, absolutely. That conflict has been dragging on for so long. And with the rebels gaining ground and both Russia and Iran deeply involved, it's a powder keg.
And then you add in the fact that Russia's dealing with the war in Ukraine, and Iran's got conflicts in Gaza and Lebanon. Who knows how all that will impact their involvement in Syria?
It's a volatile situation, that's for sure. And it underscores the need for diplomacy and international cooperation to find a way to end the violence. Wow, we have covered a lot of ground today. We've gone from political anxieties and economic uncertainties to stories of resilience, innovation, and even hope. It's been quite a journey.
It has. And it's been amazing to hear your insights on all of this. What would you say is the biggest takeaway from all these different stories?
I think it's a reminder that even when faced with these seemingly insurmountable challenges, there are still reasons to be hopeful. Whether it's groundbreaking scientific research, grassroots activism, or simply the courage of individuals standing up for what they believe in, there's always a reason to keep fighting.
That's a great point. And to our listeners out there, I would just say this. Stay curious, stay engaged with the world around you, and don't be afraid to ask those tough questions.
What stood out to you the most from all these stories? What questions are you left pondering? We want to hear from you.
Keep those mental gears turning, and let us know what other topics you'd like us to deep dive into. Until next time, stay curious.